The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, the same day Margaret's oncologist called with test results. Harold stood in their kitchen, holding both pieces of devastating news, one in each trembling hand, as if weighing which catastrophe would destroy them first. 63 years they'd lived in this house, raised 4 children under its sturdy roof, and now the bank wanted it back because they couldn't pay the medical bills that buried them deeper than Harold's father was buried in Riverside Cemetery. Before we dive into this extraordinary story of betrayal, discovery, and redemption, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The kitchen still smelled of the cinnamon rolls Margaret had baked that morning, her way of pretending everything was normal even as the chemotherapy ravaged her body and their savings account showed a balance of $247. Their golden retriever, Duke, sensed the shift in Harold's posture and patted over, pressing his graying muzzle against his master's leg. "What is it?" Margaret asked from her chair by the window, the morning light illuminating how thin she'd become, how the disease had carved hollows where fullness once lived. Harold couldn't speak the words yet. Instead, he walked to her chair and knelt beside it, his arthritic knees protesting the movement. At 79, every gesture cost something, but this moment demanded closeness. "The house?" she guessed, reading devastation in his eyes. He nodded. 90 days. Then sheriff's sale. Margaret's fingers, still elegant despite the swelling from her medications, found his weathered hand. "We knew it might come to this. I thought the children," Harold's voice cracked. "I called Richard last week. Explained about the bills, the second mortgage we took for your treatments," he said. "He said what he always says, that we should have planned better. That it's not his responsibility." Margaret's voice held no bitterness, only weary acceptance of what their eldest son had become. Richard, the investment banker who lived in a 7-bedroom house in Connecticut. Patricia, the real estate developer in California who hadn't visited in 3 years. James, the tech executive in Seattle who sent a card last Christmas with a generic signature. And Susan, their youngest, who'd married a diplomat and moved to Switzerland, gradually letting the distance become more than geographical. 4 children, Harold murmured. 4 successful, brilliant children we sacrificed everything to educate, and not one. "Don't," Margaret squeezed his hand. "We didn't raise them expecting payment. We raised them to pursue their dreams. Their dreams didn't include us, apparently." Duke whined softly, and Margaret released Harold's hand to stroke the dog's head. "At least someone still loves us unconditionally." Harold stood with difficulty, joints protesting the morning's emotional weight. He moved to the kitchen counter where their medications stood in neat rows. Margaret's cancer drugs, his heart pills, blood pressure medication, diabetes supplies. The pharmacy bill alone was $1,800 monthly, even with Medicare. "I could sell the tools," he offered, though the thought of parting with the woodworking equipment he'd collected over 5 decades felt like contemplating amputation. "And then what? Without your workshop, without your projects, what would you have left?" Margaret shook her head. "We've already sold everything valuable. My mother's jewelry, the good china, your father's watch collection. There's nothing left but memories and mortgage debt." The phone rang, startling them both. Harold answered warily, expecting another creditor. "Dad?" Patricia's voice, bright with false cheer. "I'm calling about Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's 8 months away, Patricia." "Right. Well, I wanted to give you plenty of notice. Brad and I are taking the kids to Cabo this year. You know how stressful hosting has become for Mom with her condition." Harold felt anger rise like bile. "Your mother has cancer, Patricia. It's not a condition." "Of course. I just meant, look, we thought it would be easier for everyone if we started new traditions. The kids are getting older. They have their own lives. We're losing the house." The words escaped before Harold could stop them. Silence. Then, "Oh, well, I'm sure you'll figure something out. You always do. Listen, I have a client meeting. Give Mom my love." The line went dead. Harold stood holding the receiver, staring at it as if it might explain how the daughter he'd taught to ride a bicycle had become someone who could dismiss their crisis with such casual cruelty. "Let me guess," Margaret said. "Too busy." "Always too busy." Harold hung up the phone and returned to her side. Through the window, their backyard stretched out the garden Margaret had tended for 40 years, the oak tree with the swing where grandchildren had played during increasingly rare visits, the shed where Duke's predecessors lay buried with hand-carved markers. "Maybe it's time," Margaret said quietly. "Time for what?" "To accept that our children have chosen their own paths. Paths that don't include us except as occasional obligations. They weren't always like this. Remember when Richard used to call every Sunday? When Patricia brought the grandkids for entire summers? People change, Harold. Or maybe they become who they always were, just more honestly." Duke, suddenly alert, ears perked toward the front door. A moment later, the doorbell rang. Harold shuffled to answer it, finding a young woman in a postal uniform. "Certified mail, sir. Need your signature." More bad news, Harold assumed, signing with a hand that trembled slightly. But the return address wasn't from a collection agency or mortgage company. It was from Hutchison, Weinberg, and Associates, attorneys at law. Back in the kitchen, he opened the envelope while Margaret watched, anxiously. "It's from a law firm in Nebraska," Harold said, scanning the letter, "regarding the estate of Clarence Hartley. Your mother's cousin? I thought he died years ago." "Last month, apparently. Says here he left us something in his will." Margaret straightened. "Left us what?" Harold read further, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. "His farm, 240 acres in Franklin County, Nebraska, including all structures and contents therein." "Clarence had a farm? I thought he lived in a nursing home." "He did, the last 10 years. But apparently he kept the property, never married, no children." Harold set down the letter. "We're his only living relatives." "Nebraska," Margaret repeated. "I've never even been to Nebraska." "Neither have I. But it's land, Margaret, 240 acres. That has to be worth something." Margaret was already reaching for her laptop, fingers moving with purpose despite the chemotherapy-induced numbness. "Franklin County, Nebraska. Harold, look at this. Average farmland there sells for $2,000 to $3,000 per acre. That would be nearly $500,000, maybe more." Hope flickered in her eyes for the first time in months. "We could sell it, pay off the medical debts, save the house. Or," Harold said slowly, an idea forming, "we could go there." "Go there? To Nebraska? Why not? We're losing this house anyway. The children have made it clear we're on our own. Maybe it's time for a fresh start." Margaret studied her husband. "You're serious. I've never been more serious. What's keeping us here? Memories? Obligations to children who feel none toward us? At least there we'd have land, a roof over our heads." "We don't know anything about farming. We don't need to farm it. We just need somewhere to live while we figure out our next steps. Somewhere the creditors can't immediately find us." Duke, sensing the shift in energy, stood and wagged his tail slowly, as if voting for adventure over surrender. Margaret closed the laptop. "When would we leave?" "The foreclosure gives us 90 days. But why wait? Every day here is another day of bills we can't pay, calls we can't answer. If we're going to lose everything anyway, we might as well lose it on our own terms," Margaret finished. She looked around the kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals, hosted hundreds of gatherings, built a life that their children had ultimately rejected. "You know what? You're right. Let's go." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of sorting, packing, and letting go. They kept only essentials clothes, medications, Harold's basic tools, Margaret's recipe books, photo albums, and Duke's bed. Everything else went to estate sales or donation centers. Harold called each of their children to inform them of the decision. The responses were predictably dismissive. "Richard? Nebraska? Dad, that's insane. At your age? With Mom's health? You need to be near quality medical facilities." "Unlike here, where we can't afford them anyway," Harold had replied. "Patricia, this is obviously a grief response to losing the house. You're not thinking clearly." "For the first time in years, I think we are thinking clearly," Harold had countered. "James, what about us? What about the grandkids? When's the last time you brought them to visit, James? 2 years? 3? Susan, I can't believe you're doing this without consulting us. We're informing you, not asking permission. We're still capable of making our own decisions." Each conversation ended the same way, with their children irritated at the inconvenience of parents who refused to quietly fade away. Margaret's oncologist was the only one who supported their decision. Honestly, Dr. Chen said during their final appointment, stress is as dangerous to your recovery as the cancer itself. If this move gives you peace, purpose, something to look forward to, that might be better medicine than anything I can prescribe. He transferred her records to a cancer center in Grand Island, 90 minutes from Franklin County, and gave them a 3-month supply of medications to ease the transition. On a foggy March morning, they loaded their remaining possessions into Harold's old pickup truck. Duke claimed his spot on the bench seat between them, tail thumping against the worn upholstery. As they pulled away from the house, Margaret didn't look back. 63 years, Harold said. 63 good years, Margaret corrected. But chapters end. New ones begin. The drive to Nebraska took 3 days, with frequent stops for Margaret's comfort and Duke's needs. They stayed in budget motels that accepted pets, eating simple meals and watching the landscape transform from familiar coastal regions to the vast middle of America they'd never explored. "It's so flat," Margaret observed as they crossed into Nebraska. "And empty," Harold added, noting the miles between towns, the endless sky, the grain silos standing like sentinels over dormant fields. But there was something else too, a quality of light, a silence that felt less like absence and more like possibility. Duke seemed to sense it, becoming increasingly alert as they drove deeper into agricultural country. The GPS directed them through Minden, the Franklin County seat, population 2,923. Main Street featured a courthouse, a small hospital, a grocery store, hardware store, and handful of other businesses. People waved as they passed, the automatic friendliness of rural communities. Turn left at County Road 447, the GPS instructed. Destination on your right in 14 miles. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt barely wide enough for 2 vehicles. Harold slowed the truck, navigating carefully while Margaret consulted the lawyer's paperwork. "There should be a mailbox," she said. "Number 18455. They almost missed it." The mailbox, rust-eaten and tilting, bore numbers barely visible beneath decades of weather. A rutted driveway disappeared into a cluster of overgrown trees. "This is it?" Harold asked. "This is it." The driveway curved through the trees before opening into what had once been a farmyard. Harold stopped the truck, and, for a moment, they all sat in stunned silence. The house, if it could still be called that, listed to one side like a sinking ship. Its roof had partially collapsed, windows were broken or boarded, and vines had claimed the entire north wall. The front porch had detached from the main structure, creating a gap like a broken smile. "Oh, Harold," Margaret breathed. But it wasn't despair in her voice. It was something else, wonder, perhaps, or recognition of a challenge that might be worth facing. Beyond the house, other structures dotted the property. A massive barn with better bones than the house, several outbuildings in various states of decay, and what might have been a chicken coop now serving as a raccoon condominium. Duke, however, had no hesitation. The moment Harold opened the door, the retriever jumped out and began exploring, tail wagging, as he investigated every cent and corner of his new domain. "Well," Harold said finally, "at least someone's happy. Look at the barn," Margaret pointed. "It's huge. And the frame looks solid." Indeed, while the house appeared beyond salvation, the barn stood with stubborn dignity. Built from massive timbers that had weathered over a century, its structure remained fundamentally sound despite missing boards and a partially open roof. "We can't live in the house," Harold stated the obvious. "No, but we could clear a corner of the barn, make it temporary shelter while we figure out what's salvageable. You want to live in a barn?" Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her thin face. "I've lived in a mortgage prison for the last 5 years, Harold. A barn sounds like freedom." They spent the afternoon exploring, discovering both treasures and disasters. The house's interior confirmed its uninhabitability. Floors rotted through, ceiling collapsed in multiple rooms, evidence of decades of animal inhabitants. But the barn revealed possibilities. Its concrete foundation remained solid, the main support beams showed no significant rot, and a portion of the upper loft was still dry and intact. The outbuildings yielded unexpected finds: an old but functional pot-bellied stove, stacks of usable lumber, tools rust-frozen but potentially salvageable, and in one shed, a 1,950 seconds Airstream trailer. Clarence lived in the nursing home for 10 years, Harold said, running his hand over the trailer's aluminum skin. But this looks more recent. The trailer's interior, while musty, was remarkably preserved. A small kitchen, a dinette that converted to a bed, a tiny bathroom, and storage everywhere. More importantly, it was shelter immediate and functional. "We could stay here while we work on something more permanent," Margaret suggested. "You want to live in a 30-foot trailer?" "Harold, we were about to be homeless. This is a palace compared to that." Duke barked from somewhere near the barn, the sound urgent enough to draw their attention. They found him pawing at a corner where old hay bales had been stacked against the wall. "What is it, boy?" Harold asked, pulling aside the deteriorating bales. Behind them, a door. Not a barn door, but something more finished painted, with decorative hinges and a proper lock, though the lock hung open. Harold pulled the door wide, revealing a room that shouldn't exist in a barn. Finished walls, a wooden floor, electricity that somehow still functioned when he flipped the switch. But it was the room's contents that stopped them cold. Sculptures, dozens of them, some bronze, some marble, some materials they couldn't identify. They ranged from abstract forms to startlingly realistic figures, each displaying a level of artistry that seemed impossible in this setting. "My God," Margaret whispered, moving deeper into the room. "These are, Harold, these are extraordinary." At the room's center stood the largest piece, a bronze figure of a woman, life-sized, her arms raised as if releasing birds to the sky. Even under dust and dim light, the sculpture radiated power and emotion. "There's a placard," Harold said, brushing away cobwebs. He read aloud, "Liberation, 1962. Eleanor Whitfield." Margaret gasped. "Eleanor Whitfield?" "Harold, she's one of the most important sculptors of the 20th century. Her pieces sell for, I don't even know, millions." "That's impossible. What would her work be doing in Clarence's barn?" They searched the room more carefully, finding documentation in a filing cabinet, receipts, correspondence, certificates of authenticity. The story emerged in pieces. Clarence hadn't just collected Whitfield's work, he'd been her patron, supporting her through the lean years before fame found her. In gratitude, she'd gifted him pieces throughout her career. "Look at this letter," Margaret said. "Dear Clarence, I know you'll never sell these, you stubborn fool. But someday, when you're gone, I hope they find someone who needs them as much as you needed to give me the chance to create them." Harold sank onto a dusty crate. "We thought we inherited worthless land and a falling-down house. We inherited a fortune," Margaret corrected. "A literal fortune in art." Duke patted over and lay down at their feet, satisfied that he'd done his part. That first night, they slept in the Airstream trailer, Duke curled on the floor beside their converted bed. The silence was profound. No traffic, no sirens, just whine through old timber and the distant bark of coyotes. "Are you scared?" Harold asked in the darkness. "Terrified," Margaret admitted, "but also alive. More alive than I've felt since the diagnosis. We have no idea what we're doing. When has that ever stopped us? We figured out how to raise 4 children. We can figure out how to live in a barn with millions of dollars in art, which we need to protect, and probably shouldn't sell all at once. The tax implications alone." "One step at a time," Harold said. "First, we make this place livable. Then we figure out the art. Then we build something new," Margaret finished. "Something ours." The next morning brought the full scope of their undertaking into sharp focus. Harold created lists, urgent repairs, necessary supplies, priorities for making the property habitable. Margaret researched on her phone, looking up everything from composting toilets to solar panels to auction houses that handled major artwork. Their first trip to Minden's hardware store became an introduction to small-town life. The owner, Bert Hendrickson, sized them up with friendly curiosity. "You folks bought the old Hartley place," he said. "It wasn't a question. News traveled fast in Franklin County. We inherited it," Harold clarified. "Going to try to fix it up. Ambitious." That house has been empty since Clarence went to the nursing home. Though I heard he'd visit sometimes, stay in that trailer. Did you know him well? Well as anyone, which wasn't very private man. Polite, paid his bills, but kept to himself. Always wondered what he did out there all alone. Harold and Margaret exchanged glances, but said nothing about the sculptures. Instinct suggested keeping that discovery private until they better understood its implications. Bert helped them load supplies, basic tools, cleaning materials, temporary repair items. As Harold paid, counting out cash carefully, Bert made an observation. If you folks need work done, might talk to Jim Morrison. Not the singer, he smiled at his own joke. Local contractor, semi-retired. He's selective about jobs, but honest as daylight. They found Jim Morrison at the diner having coffee, a man in his 60s with calloused hands and sharp eyes. Harold explained their situation carefully. Elderly couple, limited funds, property needing everything. I'm 79, Harold admitted. My wife has cancer. We're probably crazy to attempt this. Jim studied them. Maybe, but crazy and stupid aren't the same thing. Tell you what, I'll come look at your place. If there's something worth saving, we'll figure out terms you can manage. That afternoon, Jim walked the property with them, assessing with professional eyes. He spent the longest time in the barn, running his hands over the massive beams. This barn's better built than most houses today, he declared. That's old-growth timber, probably harvested right here on the property. With some work, you could convert part of this into living space that'll outlast all of us. We don't have money for major construction, Harold said. Didn't say you did. But you've got materials here, good lumber in those outbuildings, stone from that collapsed chimney. What you don't have in cash, you might make up in sweat equity, assuming you're not afraid of hard work. I've worked my whole life, Harold said quietly. It's all I know how to do. Jim nodded approval. I'll help where I can. Can't do heavy lifting anymore back shot, but I can direct, teach. You provide labor and materials, I'll provide knowledge. Fair? They shook hands, the beginning of an alliance that would prove crucial. Over the following weeks, a routine emerged. Morning started early, Harold working on the barn while the day was cool. He cleared debris, salvaged usable materials, and slowly carved out a corner that could become living space. Jim stopped by most days, offering guidance and occasionally spare materials from other jobs. What happens next will turn their desperate situation into an unexpected fortune, reveal secrets that change everything, and remind us why sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what really matters. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Margaret, despite her weakness, took charge of the Airstream cleaning, organizing, making it genuinely homeable. On good days, she worked in the barn's art room, carefully documenting each sculpture, researching values, connecting with experts who could advise on preservation and eventual sale. Duke appointed himself property guardian, patrolling the acreage with serious dedication. He'd found particular joy in a pond at the property's far edge, returning each evening muddy but satisfied. The first sculpture sold quietly through a private dealer. Margaret contacted a small bronze that brought $47,000 after commission, enough to pay for Margaret's medications for a year and fund basic repairs. We need to be strategic, Margaret explained to Harold over dinner in their tiny trailer kitchen. Flood the market and we'll decrease values. Sell gradually, we maintain price integrity and steady income. You've become quite the art dealer. I've become a survivor, she corrected. We both have. Their children, when they bothered to call, were horrified by the situation. You're living in a trailer? Patricia's voice dripped disdain. Like, trailer people? We're living free, Harold responded. No mortgage, no debt, no pretense. But what will people think? Which people, Patricia? The ones who wave when we drive by? Who bring casseroles when they hear Margaret's been tired? Who offer help without calculating what's in it for them? The calls grew less frequent after that, which suited Harold fine. By July, the barn's corner had transformed. Jim's guidance and Harold's determination had created a modest but comfortable living space. A bedroom, a sitting area, a basic kitchen, and a bathroom with running water thanks to the old well they'd managed to restore. It's not fancy, Harold said the day they moved from the trailer to the barn. It's ours, Margaret replied. Built with your hands, your sweat, you're refusing to give up. That makes it beautiful. They kept the art room secret, its door hidden again behind hay bales. Only Jim knew, sworn to discretion after Harold showed him, needing help to better secure the valuable space. "Sweet Jesus," Jim had whispered, seeing the sculptures. "You're sitting on a gold mine. We're sitting on Clarence's legacy," Harold corrected, "and Eleanor Whitfield's gift. We'll honor both by using it wisely." August brought unexpected challenges when Margaret's energy flagged dramatically. The drive to Grand Island for chemotherapy became increasingly difficult. It was Jim who suggested the solution. "My daughter's a nurse practitioner," he said. "Runs the clinic in town. Let me talk to her about managing your care locally with Grand Island Consulting." Amy Morrison proved as competent as her father, coordinating with Margaret's oncologist to provide local support while maintaining necessary treatments. The community's medical network, informal but effective, wrapped around them. Margaret's response to treatment improved, whether from reduced stress, cleaner air, or the psychological boost of having a project. She gained weight, color returned to her cheeks, and her voice strengthened. "I feel useful again," she told Harold one evening as they sat outside the barn, watching Duke chase fireflies. "Not just a patient or a burden, a person building something." That building accelerated when they quietly sold 2 more sculptures, netting nearly $200,000. They paid Jim fairly for his work, upgraded the barn's living space, and still had money remaining more than they'd had in years. "We should tell the children," Margaret suggested one day. "Tell them what? That we're not the pathetic failures they assumed? That we've managed quite well without their pity or charity?" "Tell them we're happy," she said simply. "That we found a way forward they couldn't imagine." But when Harold called Richard, the conversation went predictably. "Dad, I'm in the middle of something. Is this important? We wanted you to know we're doing well. The property's working out. Your mother's health is stable." "That's great, Dad. Look, I need to run. Big presentation tomorrow." Harold hung up without mentioning the sculptures, the growing bank account, or the life they'd built from nothing. His children had made their choice. He and Margaret had made theirs. September revealed the property's hidden rhythms. Wild turkeys crossed the back field each morning. Deer bedded in the grove near the pond. A pair of red-tailed hawks nested in the barn's highest beam, unbothered by the human activity below. "Clarence knew," Margaret said one morning, watching the hawks circle. "He could have sold this place, lived anywhere, but he stayed. He stayed where life made sense," Harold agreed, "where value wasn't measured in square footage or social standing." They'd been there 6 months when the letter arrived. Not another foreclosure notice or medical bill, but something unexpected, an invitation from the Whitfield Foundation to a retrospective of Eleanor's work. "How did they find us?" Harold wondered. Margaret smiled mysteriously. "I might have reached out to them. About authentication for the pieces we have, Margaret. They want to include our sculptures in the exhibition, on loan, properly credited to Clarence Hartley's collection. It would increase their value significantly." "But people would know, the children would know." "Yes," she agreed, "they would." Harold considered this. His pride had taken such beatings from bankruptcy, from his children's abandonment, from age itself. Did it matter now who knew about their fortune? "The exhibition's in Chicago," Margaret continued. "We could drive there, make a trip of it. You want to go?" "I want to show the world what Clarence preserved, what Eleanor created, what we're guardians of now." Duke chose that moment to drop a particularly muddy stick at their feet, tail wagging optimistically. "And I suppose he'd come too?" Harold asked. "He's part of the team," Margaret laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in years. The trip to Chicago became an odyssey of discovery. They drove slowly, stopping frequently, Duke enjoying every rest area and small-town park. Margaret's strength held steady, buoyed by purpose and anticipation. They stayed at a modest hotel that welcomed pets, far from the exhibition's glittering venue, but perfect for their needs. The night before the opening, Margaret laid out their best clothes, nothing fancy, but clean and dignified. "Nervous?" Harold asked. "Excited," she corrected. "We're not going as supplicants or social climbers. We're going as custodians of something magnificent." The exhibition space overwhelmed them, initially soaring white walls, perfect lighting, art patrons in designer clothing sipping champagne. Their sculptures, Clarence's collection, occupied a special room with a placard explaining the patron's role in Eleanor's development. "Oh my God, Mother?" Patricia's voice cut through the crowd noise. She stood frozen, champagne glass halfway to her lips, staring at her parents as if they were ghosts. Richard appeared beside her, equally stunned. "What are you doing here?" "Attending the exhibition," Harold replied calmly. "We loaned several pieces from our collection." "Your collection?" Richard's voice rose. "You're living in a barn in Nebraska." "We live in a converted barn on 240 acres of paid-for land," Margaret corrected, "and we happen to own one of the most significant private collections of Eleanor Whitfield's work." The information seemed to short-circuit their children's comprehension. James and Susan, alerted by sibling texts, soon joined the uncomfortable gathering. "I don't understand," Susan said. "When you called, you said you inherited some rundown farm." "We did. The rundown farm contained Clarence's collection. He was Eleanor's first patron, her most consistent supporter. She gifted him pieces throughout her career." "How much?" James began, then stopped, apparently realizing the crassness of the question. "Millions," Harold said simply. "Though we've only sold what we needed for repairs and Margaret's treatment, the rest we're preserving, possibly for a museum eventually." "But you let us think you were destitute," Patricia accused. "We were destitute," Margaret said. "You knew that when we lost the house. We called each of you, explained our situation. The response was unanimous. We were on our own." "That was different," Richard protested. You thought we were useless burdens," Harold finished. "Too old, too sick, too poor to matter. And you know what? You were right about the poor part then. But poor and worthless aren't synonymous, as you apparently believed." A curator approached, touching Margaret's elbow gently. "Mrs. Hartley? The foundation director would like to meet you. She's very interested in hearing about Clarence's relationship with Eleanor." Margaret smiled. "Of course. Harold, would you join me?" They walked away from their stunned children, Duke padding alongside, leaving behind questions that no longer needed answering. The exhibition's success exceeded expectations. Art journalists interviewed them about Clarence, about finding the collection, about their plans. They answered honestly, elderly couple, saved by unexpected inheritance, building new life from ruins. "It's a beautiful story," one reporter said. "Lost art, found purpose, renewal against odds. It's just life," Harold replied. "Messier than stories, but more interesting." Their children attempted reconciliation that evening, suggesting dinner at an upscale restaurant. "We can't," Margaret declined. "Duke's waiting at the hotel, and we need to rest. The drive home tomorrow." "Home," Patricia repeated. "To Nebraska, yes. Where the hawks nest in our barn and the deer drink from our pond. Where neighbors know our names and Jim Morrison teaches Harold traditional building techniques. Home." They left Chicago the next morning, their old truck loaded with exhibition catalogs and memories. The children had promised to visit, to call more often, to rebuild connections. Harold doubted the follow-through but appreciated the gesture. "They saw our worth only when it had dollar signs attached," he said, as Chicago's skyline receded. Maybe Margaret allowed. Or maybe they saw us happy and realized what they'd missed. Either way, it changes nothing about our choices. The drive home took 4 days, deliberately extended. They visited small museums, eaten at local diners, walked Duke in countless parks. Margaret's energy remained steady, her engagement bright. "I haven't felt this alive in years," she confessed one evening, watching sunset paint Nebraska's sky in impossible colors. "Since the diagnosis? Since before that? Since we started living for appearances, for the children's approval, for some imagined future that required sacrificing every present moment. And now I wake up excited to see what the day brings, even with cancer, even with uncertainty, especially with those things, actually. They make each good day precious." They arrived home, and it was home now. Absolutely, to find Jim Morrison had organized a barn raising of sorts. Not to raise a barn, but to improve theirs. A dozen locals had contributed labor, materials, expertise. Figured you folks had done enough alone? Jim explained, community means helping when help's needed. The barn now boasted better insulation, sealed windows, even a small deck where they could sit and survey their domain. Inside, someone had built proper shelving for Margaret's art books, installed better lighting in their living space. This is too much, Harold protested. Overcome. This is neighbors, Bert from the hardware store corrected. You're part of Minden now. We take care of our own. Margaret wept not the bitter tears of loss and fear, but the sweet overflow of unexpected belonging. That night, they sat on their new deck, Duke between them, watching stars emerge in the vast Nebraska sky. The Milky Way, invisible in their old suburban neighborhood, stretched horizon to horizon like nature's own artwork. We're going to make it, Margaret said quietly. We already have, Harold replied. Everything else is just bonus time. Fall deepened into winter, their first Nebraska winter. Harold learned to manage snow removal, to keep water pipes from freezing, to stack wood for their efficient stove. Margaret continued treatments at the local clinic, her numbers improving enough that Dr. Chen in Grand Island expressed pleased surprise. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it, she advised during a video consultation. What they were doing was living fully, intentionally, without apology or pretense. Harold restored furniture in the barn's workshop. Margaret researched and wrote about the collection, working with universities interested in Eleanor Whitfield's legacy. Duke aged gracefully, still patrolling, but more slowly, often content to supervise from his bed. They sold another sculpture in December, putting most proceeds into a trust for the property's eventual conversion to an artist retreat center. Clarence had supported one artist. They would support many. It's what he would want. Margaret said, signing papers. What Eleanor would want. Art begets art. Christmas approached with none of the old obligations. No massive family gatherings to orchestrate, no gift competitions, no pretending harmony where none existed. They decorated simply lights on the barn, a small tree in their living space. Duke's bed festooned with ribbon he immediately removed. On Christmas Eve, it snowed. They sat by their window, watching white blanket the fields, transform the world into pristine possibility. The phone rang their children, calling in succession with careful holiday greetings. We're thinking of visiting in spring. Richard offered. You'd be welcome, Harold said, meaning it. Spring was far enough away to hope for genuine change. Patricia sent. Photos of grandchildren they barely knew, promised to bring them someday. James discussed his work, almost asking about theirs before catching himself. Susan called from Switzerland, the distance somehow less significant than when she'd lived closer but cared less. They're trying. Margaret observed after the last call. Too little? Too late? Maybe, or maybe it's never too late for what matters. We're proof of that. On Christmas morning, they exchanged simple gifts, new gloves for Harold, a warmer robe for Margaret, premium treats for Duke. Jim Morrison stopped by with homemade cookies from his wife. The pastor from Minden's Lutheran Church, where they'd started attending, brought communion to save them the snowy drive. You folks have been a blessing to this community, Pastor Williams said. Your generosity, your example of resilience. They hadn't mentioned the sculpture's value to anyone locally, but they'd quietly supported community needs, the food bank, the clinic's equipment fund, scholarships for local students, anonymous gifts that everyone somehow knew came from the old couple in Clarence's barn. As winter deepened, they developed rhythms suited to their reality. Harold worked mornings when Margaret felt strongest. Afternoons were for reading, correspondence with art dealers, gentle walks when weather permitted. Evenings belonged to documentaries, discussion, the deep companionship of shared survival. I've been thinking about the children, Margaret said one February evening. Dangerous territory. No, seriously, they're not evil, Harold. They're just limited, trapped in their own versions of success, unable to imagine alternatives. You're defending them? I'm understanding them, which isn't the same as excusing them. They chose safety, safe careers, safe marriages, safe distances from anything that might demand actual sacrifice. We chose safety too, for years, until we couldn't, until loss forced us to discover what we actually valued. They haven't had that gift yet. Gift? Harold laughed. Cancer and bankruptcy are gifts? The clarity they brought was The permission to stop pretending, stop acquiring, stop performing success for an audience that didn't actually care. Harold considered this. Outside, wind howled across empty fields, but inside their barn home, warmth prevailed, not just from the stove, but from purpose, from partnership, from the peculiar peace of accepting what is rather than mourning what should be. You might be right, he conceded, though I still resent how they treated us. Resentment's just another chain, Margaret said, and we're free now, remember? March brought unexpected warmth and unexpected visitors. James arrived first, driving a rental car that looked absurdly urban on their dirt road. He emerged tentatively, as if unsure of his welcome. Duke, ever the diplomat, ambled over for inspection, tail wagging cautiously. "Hi, Dad," James said. "James." Harold nodded, not moving from his position on the deck. Let the boy come to him. James climbed the steps, looking around with genuine interest. "This is not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Squalor. Honestly, Mom made it sound like you were basically camping. Your mother's with Jim Morrison at the hardware store. And we are camping, in a sense. Camping permanently in a place we own outright, with everything we need and nothing we don't." James absorbed this, then surprised Harold by sitting on the deck's rough bench. "I've been thinking about what you said at the exhibition, about us abandoning you. And you were right. We did. I did. I told myself it was for your own good, that you needed professional care we couldn't provide. But really, I just didn't want to deal with it. With you getting older, with Mom being sick, with any of it." Harold waited. Apologies came easy. Change came harder. "I want to do better," James continued. "I don't know how, exactly, but I want to try." "Why now?" James met his eyes. "Because I saw you at that exhibition. Saw you happy, confident, discussing art with experts. Saw Mom glowing despite the cancer, and I realized I don't know you at all. Never did. Just knew the roles you played for us. And now you're curious about the real people? Now I'm ashamed I never was before. It was honest, at least." Harold relaxed slightly. "Your mother will be pleased to see you." Indeed, Margaret's joy at finding James there illuminated the barn. She embraced him fully, past hurts seemingly forgotten in present possibility. Over dinner, simple fare and their makeshift kitchen conversation flowed more naturally than it had in years. "You've really built something here," James observed. "We've built a life," Margaret corrected. "Not impressive by conventional standards, but profoundly ours." James stayed 3 days, helping Harold with repairs, learning about the art collection, walking the property with new eyes. When he left, promises to return seemed genuine rather than obligatory. "One down," Harold commented. "Don't be cynical. He's trying." "I know. I'm trying to let him." Patricia arrived 2 weeks later, designer luggage comically out of place in the barn. Her initial discomfort was obvious, nose wrinkling at rural smells, heels sinking in spring mud. But she, too, stayed, gradually unwinding from urban armor. "I've been seeing a therapist," she admitted on her second day, "about family patterns, about how I've repeated with my kids what I learned from how we treated you." "How you treated us," Harold corrected gently. "Yes, that. I'm sorry. Not just words. I know I've said words before, but actually sorry, actively working to change sorry." She proved it by returning monthly, bringing grandchildren who discovered the pond, the hawks, the simple pleasure of Harold's workshop. Ivy, the eldest, showed artistic tendencies that Margaret carefully nurtured. Richard took longest but eventually came, drawn perhaps by siblings' reports or genuine remorse. His visit was awkward. He struggled without urban amenities, without the armor of his professional identity, but he stayed a full week, gradually shedding layers of pretense. "I was so angry," he confessed one evening. "When you sold the house to save mine, then lost everything, angry at you for making me feel guilty, for needing help I didn't want to give." "We didn't ask for your help," Harold pointed out. "No, but your need was obvious. And I resented it, resented you for aging, for getting sick, for requiring care that might interfere with my life. That's honest, at least. Mom says honesty's all we have in the end. Your mother's wise, wiser than her children, certainly. Susan managed only video calls from Switzerland, but they came regularly, filled with genuine interest rather than obligation. The grandchildren learned Harold and Margaret's names, recognized Duke, asked about the hawks and deer. By the first anniversary of their arrival, patterns had evolved. The children visited not constantly, but consistently. They contributed not from guilt, but from growing appreciation. They engaged not with the parents they'd expected, but with the people Harold and Margaret had become. Family reunion? James suggested for Thanksgiving. Here? Patricia asked. In the barn? Where else? Richard said. It's home. Their home. Margaret looked at Harold, silent communication flowing between them. We'd like that, she decided, but small, simple, no productions. Duke probably wouldn't tolerate productions, James noted, making everyone laugh. The reunion happened cramped in the barn, makeshift sleeping arrangements, too many people for one bathroom. It was chaotic and imperfect and unexpectedly healing. Grandchildren ran wild across the property. Adult children helped with meals, with cleanup, with understanding. This is what we missed, Susan said via laptop propped on the kitchen counter. Not the house, not the formal dinners. This, you two, just being yourselves. We were always ourselves, Margaret said. You just weren't looking. No, Patricia agreed. We weren't. Too busy looking at ourselves, our careers, our curated lives. Harold found himself on the deck with Richard as evening settled. Proud of what you've built here, Dad, Richard said. We didn't build it for pride. I know, that's what makes it remarkable. You built it for survival, then for joy. Most of us never get past survival. You're past it. Successful career, beautiful family. Successful? Maybe. But joyful? I'm learning that from watching you and Mom. Learning it might not be too late to choose differently. It's never too late until it is, Harold said. Your mother taught me that. Margaret appeared, wrapping a shawl against evening chill. The kids want to know if they can camp by the pond. In November? Richard asked. They're young, she smiled. November's just a word to them. They set up tents, built a fire, told stories under stars. Harold and Margaret retired to their barn, leaving younger generations to create memories. Duke, torn between house and campfire, finally chose warmth, curling by the stove with satisfied sighs. Good day, Margaret murmured, already drowsing. Good year, Harold corrected. Good life, actually. The best, she agreed, and slept. Morning brought grandchildren at the door, faces bright with cold and adventure, stories of coyotes heard and meteors seen. Margaret made pancakes on her simple stove. Harold taught the boys basic woodworking. Patricia and James walked the property, planning improvements that respected rather than transformed. We could help more, Patricia suggested at breakfast. Not take over, just contribute. We're fine, Harold said automatically. I know you are, but maybe we need to help. For us, not just you. Margaret and Harold exchanged glances. What did you have in mind? Winterizing improvements, medical equipment, upgrades, maybe a proper guest cabin so visits are easier? Built by whom? Harold asked suspiciously. Built together, James said. Next summer, all of us. Learn what you've been doing, help expand it. Like a barn raising, Richard added, but for family. Harold felt his defenses crumbling. These weren't the children who'd abandoned them, not anymore. Loss had changed everyone, just differently. We'll think about it, he conceded. The reunion ended with genuine embraces, specific plans for next visits, promises that felt solid rather than empty. Watching taillights disappear down the dirt road, Harold slipped his arm around Margaret's waist. They came back, she said, wonderingly. We all came back, from different kinds of loss. Duke barked once, whether in agreement or because deer had appeared in the back field, they couldn't tell. But it felt like punctuation to a chapter that had started with foreclosure and ended with fullness. Winter settled over Franklin County with serious intent. Harold had improved the barn's insulation, but Nebraska cold still found ways inside. They adapted more layers, closer to the stove, earlier to bed. Duke grew a magnificent winter coat and seemed impervious to temperature. Margaret's health held steady through the cold months, remarkable given her oncologist's warnings about winter vulnerability. The local clinic managed her care expertly, consulting with Grand Island as needed but preventing most long trips. Your numbers are better than last year, Amy Morrison noted during a February check. Stress reduction really does affect outcomes. Hard to feel stressed when you wake up to complete quiet, Margaret said. When your biggest decision is which sculpture to research or what soup to make, they'd settled into rhythms that honored both limitation and possibility. Harold worked his workshop mornings when arthritis permitted. Margaret wrote letters to grandchildren, articles about the collection, a memoir she might never finish but enjoyed creating. The art sales continued strategically, a major piece to a museum in January, 2 smaller works to private collectors in March. Each sale funded years of modest living, plus anonymous gifts to neighbors in need. We're like reverse Robin Hoods, Harold joked, selling to the rich to live simply and help quietly. Better than hoarding beauty in a barn, Margaret replied. Eleanor would approve. Jim Morrison stopped by regularly, friendship having replaced professional relationship. He brought news, shared coffee, taught Harold techniques passed down through generations of builders. You know what I appreciate about you folks? He said one snowy morning. You don't pretend things are other than they are. Barn's a barn. Age is age. Cancer's cancer. But you find the good in what's real. What else can we do? Harold asked. Reality's the only material we have to work with. Most people spend their lives fighting that truth. You two embraced it. The conversation stayed with Harold as he worked alone that afternoon, shaping wood into something functional and beautiful. They had embraced reality, financial ruin, health challenges, family abandonment. But in embracing, rather than denying, they'd found unexpected space for joy. Margaret napped more these days, energy carefully parceled out, but her naps came with smiles, her waking with purpose. She'd completed documentation of the entire collection, created a digital catalog that would outlive them all. Legacy work, she called it, making sure Clarence and Eleanor's connection isn't forgotten. Spring's first hints brought familiar renewal. Crocuses pushed through snow, geese returned to the pond, Duke resumed his patrol duties with winter-stiff enthusiasm. And with spring came the children, as promised. They arrived together this time, caravanning from various airports, laden with supplies and determination. True to their word, they'd come to build. Where do we start, Richard? Asked Harold. Foundation, Harold replied. Everything depends on foundation. For 2 weeks they worked together. Not the formal holiday gatherings of the past, but messy, sweaty, collaborative labor. James proved surprisingly skilled with tools. Patricia organized supplies with business efficiency turned practical. Richard's strength compensated for Harold's limitations. Even Susan participated via video, researching techniques and troubleshooting problems. Margaret supervised from a deck chair, Duke beside her, offering suggestions and encouragement. Watching her family work together on something tangible, voluntary, generous, it was its own healing. The guest cabin rose slowly but steadily. Nothing fancy, a simple structure that echoed the barn's honest architecture. But it was theirs, built by their hands, their sweat, their choosing to show up. Evenings brought exhausted satisfaction. They ate simply, slept deeply, woke ready for more. Grandchildren who visited weekends learned construction basics, pride in creation, the value of physical effort. This is harder than my gym, Patricia panted, hauling lumber. But more purposeful, James added. I'll drive past 1,000 buildings in my life. But I'll always know I helped build this one. When they finished roof on, walls up, basic interior framed, they stood together admiring their work. Imperfect but solid, simple but sufficient. For future visits, Richard said. For being family differently, Patricia added. Harold felt Margaret's hands slip into his. They'd built more than a cabin. They'd rebuilt connection on terms that honored everyone's autonomy while acknowledging interdependence. The children left gradually, work and life calling them back. But they left differently than before, reluctant rather than relieved, planning returns rather than avoiding them. We did it, Margaret said that night. Did what? Showed them another way to be. Not the way we were, not the way they were, but something. New? Think it will last? Does anything? But it's real now, and that's enough. Summer brought its own gifts. The property bloomed with wildflowers. Neither of them had planted nature's artwork complementing Eleanor's sculptures. Harold built raised garden beds. Margaret could tend without bending. They grew tomatoes, herbs, flowers for cutting. Their routines accommodated age and illness without surrendering to them. Morning coffee on the deck, watching hawks circle. Afternoon rest during heat's peak. Evening walks to the pond, Duke moving slowly but determinedly beside them. "I want to talk about what happens," Margaret said one evening, "when I'm gone." Margaret: "No, Harold. We've been lucky, had this bonus time. But we both know what's coming. I need to know you'll be okay." "I won't be okay, but I'll survive. Is that what you need to hear?" She squeezed his hand. "I need to know you won't just survive. That you'll keep living, keep building, keep welcoming the children when they come. I'm 80 years old, and you've done your best living in the last 2 years. Promise me you won't stop. I promise," he said, meaning it despite the ache of imagining life without her. They made practical plans that evening, where Margaret wanted to be buried, the small cemetery in Minden, how to handle the remaining art museum donations primarily, what to do with the property, conservation easement, ensuring it remained agricultural. "And Duke?" Margaret asked. "Duke goes where I go, as long as he's able. Then he rests beside you." "The children will help," she said. "They're different now. They'll show up." "I know. That's your gift to them, showing them how to show up." August brought the crisis they'd both expected and dreaded. Margaret woke one morning, unable to rise, her body finally overwhelmed by the disease it had fought so valiantly. Harold called Amy Morrison first, then their children. Medical response was swift and competent. Family response was immediate and genuine. Within 24 hours, the guest cabin filled with children and grandchildren, drawn by love rather than obligation. Margaret spent her last week at home, in the barn she'd helped transform, surrounded by people who'd learned to see her truly. Hospice nurses came daily, but family provided primary care, taking shifts, sharing memories, offering presents. "No regrets," she told Harold one afternoon, the two of them alone, while others prepared dinner. "We did it right, the second time around. We did it together," he corrected. "That made it right," she smiled, the expression still capable of stopping his heart. "Take care of Duke, and let the children take care of you sometimes. It's not weakness, it's wisdom." "I'll try." "And Harold, that last big sculpture, Liberation, don't sell it. Keep it where we found it, where Clarence meant it to stay. Some things shouldn't be reduced to money. I promise." She died at sunset, children around her bed, Harold holding her hand, Duke resting his head on her feet. Peaceful, prepared, profoundly loved. The life they'd rebuilt had given her what the old life couldn't, a death surrounded by genuine connection rather than formal obligation. The funeral in Minden packed the small church, not because Margaret was prominent, but because she was known. Neighbors, medical staff, fellow church members, Jim Morrison, and the hardware store crew all came to honor a woman who'd shown that rebuilding was possible at any age. The children stayed a week after, helping Harold adjust, planning ongoing support that respected his independence. They understood now what they'd missed before, that caring for aging parents wasn't burden, but privilege, not obligation, but opportunity. "We'll take turns visiting," Patricia explained. "Not to check on you, but to be with you, to keep learning what you and Mom figured out." "I'm not going anywhere," Harold assured them. "This is home, more than our old house ever was." They believed him, saw the peace in his grief, the purpose that outlived partnership. Margaret had built, well, not just barn and cabin, but a framework for continuing. After they left, Harold and Duke settled into new patterns, lonelier but not lost, grieving but not destroyed. He worked his workshop, tended Margaret's garden, welcomed visitors who came to see the art that remained. Thinking of turning the whole place into that artist's retreat, he told Jim one day, like Margaret planned, somewhere people can come to create, to rebuild, to find what matters. She'd like that. She'd love it. Probably already arranging it from wherever she is. Jim laughed. Wouldn't put it past her. Harold sold 2 more sculptures that fall, establishing an endowment for the retreat center. The children helped with legal structure, grandchildren with naming it. Margaret's Haven, where art meets heart. The first artist arrived the following spring, referred by foundations Eleanor Whitfield had supported. They came broken in various ways, by loss, by failure, by life's ordinary devastations. They found in the barn what Harold and Margaret had found space to rebuild, community without judgment, beauty preserved against odds. Harold remained the careful guardian, Duke the aging but devoted greeter. Together they welcomed strangers who became friends, watched art emerge from ashes, proved daily that endings could become beginnings. "You did it, Margaret," he said each night, looking at her photo before sleep. "We did it. Built something from nothing, found meaning in loss, created legacy from love." Duke would thump his tail in agreement, then settle for the night, two old souls keeping faith with one who'd shown them how to transform catastrophe into quiet triumph. The barn stood solid against Nebraska weather, sheltering art and artists, embodying what Harold and Margaret had discovered too late for their first life, but just in time for their second, that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what's worth keeping, that families can be rebuilt on better foundations, that even in life's last chapters, new stories can begin. In the hidden room, liberation remained where Clarence had placed it, where Eleanor had minted arms raised in bronze benediction, blessing all who found their way to this unlikely sanctuary. This place where collapse became creation, where an old couple's desperate flight became everyone's destination for healing. The children visited regularly now, bringing grandchildren who ran wild across the same fields, discovered the same pond, learned the same lessons about value beyond price. They maintained the buildings, supported the artists, honored what their parents had built from the wreckage of abandonment. "They saved us," Patricia said one evening, watching sunset from the deck Harold had built. "By saving themselves first, they saved us all." Richard nodded, showed us what actually matters, what family really means. "Only took complete disaster to teach us," James added wryly. "Better late than never," Susan said from the laptop screen. "Better hard won than easily assumed." Harold listened from inside, pretending to doze in his chair. But he heard and knew Margaret heard wherever she was, and felt the circle close properly at last. Not the circle they'd planned in their suburban house with its mortgage and medical bills and children who visited from duty, but the circle they'd created from necessity, from courage, from the simple decision to keep going when stopping would have been easier. Duke patted over, settling at his feet with a contented sigh. Still here, still watching, still part of the unlikely family that had emerged from the ashes of the expected one. "Good boy," Harold murmured. "Good, long life." Outside, the first stars appeared in the vast Nebraska sky. Inside the barn, art waited in patient beauty for tomorrow's viewers. In the guest cabin, grandchildren whispered after lights out, planning adventures. Across the property, Margaret's presence lingered in the garden, in the carefully documented sculptures, in the retreat center bearing her name, in the family she'd helped transform through the simple act of insisting on dignity when indignity would have been easier. Harold closed his eyes, not sleeping but resting in the profound peace of promises kept, love proven, life rebuilt, and shared and celebrated against all odds. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, his own health, Duke's age, the retreat's needs, the family's ongoing evolution. But tonight was sufficient. Tonight was full. Tonight was home. The barn creaked gently in the evening breeze, solid and sheltering, exactly as it needed to be. Like everything else in their reconstructed life, imperfect but genuine, challenging but worthwhile, unexpected but exactly right.